15 years ago, I started my style journey. I'm now 32 years old, and this podcast is dedicated to the lessons that would have saved me a lot of pain along the way. Today, I'd like to focus on the topic of communication, not just as it relates to style, but it's definitely deeply tied together. But first, I want to shout out my links. If you're watching this on YouTube, please drop a like, subscribe to my channel. I upload a new video every week. If you're listening to this on Spotify, I'd also appreciate if you left this a little bit of love, maybe a review, and as well as a comment. Really help me out. As if you could share this with a friend, that would also be deeply appreciated and really help out the channel. So if you have any friends who are interested in improving their style or just self-improvement or psychology in general, definitely send this over to them. So I wanted to address a problem, and this probably applies in your life, but I really feel like men are lacking a lot of confidence because they lack they lack language in crucial areas of communication. So just a few examples are identity, emotions, and behavior, right? The male identity, we are sort of pushed into these roles, and ideas like masculinity are really foisted upon guys. I was just speaking to someone today who, as a child, he was in ballet, and he spoke about how he had to justify that. He had to explain, people would mess with him and he'd say, "Oh, this football player, he takes ballet for his balance and his athleticism." He'd have to justify this thing instead of just being able to say, this is a way that I express and I'm passionate about this, and that's masculine. That is my masculinity. And I don't need your, you know, limits put on me, right? I think it's funny because everyone's so concerned with being masculine that they allow themselves to be so incredibly limited. And it's so unmasculine to limit yourself based on what the world's judgment is, instead of trying to be expansive and impactful and change the world in a positive way. Everyone's so worried whether or not their contribution to the world is masculine enough for a man to do it. That's identity, right? There's so many parts of male identity that are not perfectly masculine. And everyone is trying to shove themselves into this tiny box, or they're not, but they feel like that's a negative attribute in them. Emotions, I don't think it's a secret that, men feeling and talking about their emotions is something that's, frowned upon, or at least has been historically. And that's not to say that guys should be, breaking down in tears in the middle of Walmart, but in order, feeling is such an important part of the experience of life, right? It's not just what happened, it's how does it affect us? What does it mean about us? And those are all signals that we get from feelings. And of course, behavior. Men walk this way, they sit this way, they talk this way. Your voice has to sound this way, your cadence has to sound this way. You have to look a certain way, right? There's all these ways that everyone's fighting to fall into a box. And that's not to say that some behaviors would be better off, wouldn't be better off fixed. There's definitely a lot of positivity to, working on your speech patterns and working on your presentation. I mean, this is a style channel, right? Like we're all about working on your presentation. But the point is that all of these restrictions, they create this like fog of fear around everything that men want to do. And a lot of that is clamping down on our language, be that literal like words, the words that we speak or write, or the way that we express ourselves. Expression itself is language. I think it's like 70% of language is nonverbal, right? You don't need to speak the same language as someone. You can read their facial expressions. There's a lot that you can know about people just from their body language, the way that they groom, the way that they dress. And I think that that has been not only devalued, but actively discouraged in men. And a lot of that has been by other men. And I think a lot of that stems from, you know, I, some of it's just historical, but a lot of it really does come from insecurity. And, you know, I can't express myself, or I wasn't allowed to express myself, so I'm going to continue that as the standard, right? I was brought up that this is the way a man behaves, and that's what stopped me from being able to express. Therefore, I'm going to take that out on other people and mock their expression and make them feel bad about the things that interest and excite them. And that's such a shame because we're all on journeys. And another thing that I spoke about in this call with this guy was how him and his sons had gone through so many different jobs, and only by doing jobs that they didn't enjoy were they able to find the pieces of those jobs that they did and then look for careers that met those criteria. It's so powerful and important to take action and to have experiences and to try things and not worry too much about what other people think. You know, um, I I learned a lot. Like I've been drawing my entire life, and I there are so many leaps and bounds in my ability to draw that I would not have gotten if I had rejected, you know, artistic artistry that was considered feminine. You know, I learned so much about facial structure and shading the human body, shading faces and adding dimension to my drawings. I had such a challenge. I was so annoyed that I couldn't add dimension to my drawings in the way that I wanted. And the way that I learned how to add facial dimension and add dimension to drawings was actually watching makeup tutorials, was actually watching contouring videos, watching makeup artists transform themselves into characters from other movies or just, make drastic changes to their appearance and using makeup to create shadows on their faces and restructure their face essentially. It taught me how facial aesthetics work and how to shade my drawings in order to make them look more dimensional and realistic. And I never would have made this giant leap in something that I'm so passionate about if I had limited myself to what was, masculine and acceptable for a man, right? It's unacceptable for me to watch this tutorial or this video or be interested in this art form because it belongs to women. Yeah, so that's something that I've noticed as a problem is this stifling of different areas of communication in actual spoken language, but especially in expression like art or music or the way men dress or groom. There's this just broad dampening of allowing men to describe how they feel, who they are in and to even to make mistakes along that route. There's such a fear around it that you so many guys never have that journey of finding themselves because of the trial and error and the fear of embarrassment along the way. We're the flip side of that is that we're all expected to have it all together. We're dissuaded from building these tools to be stable and central in our own lives. Like I said, we're dissuaded from having this communication in that you honestly need in order to figure out who you are, right? Talking to people and talking about who you are and hearing yourself speak about yourself and thinking, was that me? Was that not me? Is that true about me? Is that not true about me? That interplay between people allows for the introspection and building of identity. And so much of that is just taken away. So, what's what ends up happening is, guys, we have all of this responsibility put upon us. You need to go to college and get a good job, and you need to be successful at work, and you need to get married and have a family and be successful in your relationships. But how are you supposed to be successful in work when you're never taught coping strategies for your stress, when you don't know who you are enough to know whether or not a job is going to be good for you? If you are making a career change, how do you know what career to change to if you don't have an idea of what it is about your current career that really appeals to you? I was speaking to someone the other day who, he's in a career that he hates. He's trying to get out of it, but he feels so trapped because he's so good at it, and he can't see the patterns in what he loved about it originally in order to look out in the world and become the person that he needs to be to find his next step. And a lot of that is, like I said, because we lack this language and communication about ourselves, even just to ourselves. We're unable to communicate and figure out who we are and what our strengths are, and acknowledge our weaknesses and find, areas that play to those. And of course, in relationship, right? Isn't that the biggest cliche, that the wives all want their husbands to open up and the men are all emotionally stunted? But but we're angry. We get to be emotional when we're angry. We don't get to be aware of how we actually feel and our own values. It's really all about, how can I sacrifice myself on the altar of getting everybody else's needs met. And that's not to say that women do not sacrifice themselves on the altar of getting everyone else's needs met. Of course they do. But I work with men. I'm handling men's struggles, and there's someone else out there who can talk about the topic of, women sacrificing themselves on that altar. But you know, it's so important to have language. And I know that in my own life, I felt very lost for a very long time. I knew that I didn't really like myself, but I didn't really have a myself not to like. Like, if I was being realistic, I didn't have a clear identity. Or you could say that what I didn't like about myself is that I didn't have a clear identity. There was nothing that I could point to and be proud of. And that's not to say that there really wasn't. I There are things that I was proud of back then that I'm still very proud of, but I think I lacked some permission around being proud of those things. Like I said, my artistry, nobody else I knew was really artistic and creative in this way. There's a lot of there was a lot of awkwardness in my younger years that, looking back, definitely had to do with some of my personality traits, which were so powerful to put language to through, the Jungian cognitive functions and Enneagram, the Big Five. And all of that really started with putting language to my style and starting that journey of building language to describe myself in the beginning in sort of primitive ways, and building that out into more and more complex ways. The more in depth you can describe something, the more you can know it. And in order to know yourself, you really have to put language to the different parts of yourself. So that's a really big part of why I'm so passionate about style. And I really do think that style is an area where you can really remedy this. It's a really low risk, high reward way to ask these tough questions about, who am I and what do I like? What do I want to transmit out into the world? I have the style archetypes quiz. You can take that on my LinkedIn page, and it breaks down the male style into three archetypes, which are essentially characters, right? So you're going to identify with one character the most, maybe two, maybe all three. But your balance and the way that you express that is going to be unique to you. But it all starts with that language. And for me, finding the archetypes and finding out that, I was rebellious and refined style, finding out that there was, a masculine archetype for my creativity, for my artistry, for my out of the box thinking, it really allowed me to feel masculine and feel confident in that, in something that I, for a long time, really didn't think belonged to me. And, I think the rugged archetype is one that a lot of people associate with masculinity, but there are so many men who fall into the other two archetypes or who embody the rugged archetype in a way you wouldn't expect, that I really believe there's a lot of shame that comes along in the male experience when and because we don't have the language to describe ourselves and see that what sets us apart is normal and acceptable and lovable and sometimes incredibly powerful. My finding out that I was a feeler on the Myers-Briggs system, in the Jungian cognitive functions. I used ENFP preferences, finding out that I made my best decisions by going inside myself and examining my feelings and my values around something. Seeing that I had this incredible strength in going to the deeper, darker places in myself and examining my motivations and thereby empowering myself to help other people examine their motivations, their deeper, uncomfortable places. Like, I would have never found this ability, this unique gift that I have to give to the world that is so powerful for the people that I speak to and help and work with, if I had never gotten on this road of language. For me, like I said, it all started when I found this language around style with the archetypes, being able to describe myself and express that through clothing. Having words that I could describe myself with allowed me to build intention into other areas. It allowed me to expand my language in other regions. Right now, I'm working on business. That's, a big piece. In the past, it was fitness, and before that, it was style. This whole route would have never taken place if style hadn't come into my life, and that's a reason why I'm so passionate about it and why I believe it's so powerful. But I also think that without it, I would have never gotten the language to expand my artistry, my personality, my confidence, my sense of self, my understanding of self, my communication with others. There's so many incredibly powerful areas of life that I think a lot of men are being actively deprived of. And a lot of that deprivation is coming from the world trying to take away our words and our communication, especially visual and nonverbal communication. That's those are my thoughts on the topic. I'd really love to hear what you think about style as communication, about the war on words. I don't know. Maybe I'm just coining that term, but have you had this in your life where you felt like there was something intrinsic in you that you had to push away or that you couldn't fully express, that you didn't feel was accepted by people and that made you feel wrong? And have you since found that to be a power and an ability in your adulthood, or is that still something that you push away and makes you uncomfortable? I'd love to hear about this in the YouTube comments, in the Spotify comments, wherever you're watching or listening to this. Definitely let me know. Check me out on LinkedIn. It's Shlomo Hamnek. There's a bright pink banner. You really can't miss it. I try to post clips from this podcast there and write some posts that expand on some of the ideas. But this is honestly right now my forum for diving deeper into, the my approach to style and the areas of self-improvement that I believe style facilitates and that I find to be incredibly important and empowering. Once again, leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, and check out my style archetypes quiz. It's in the featured section as well as my bio on my LinkedIn page. Once again, Shlomo Hamnek, bright pink banner. You can't miss it. And have a wonderful week.